Okay, so the Gemara continues, and the last few pieces we had done were on Daf Chavav, page 26 in Shabbos. Now the Ein Yaakov jumps to Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis 28b, and our shir today is again sponsored in memory of Chana Devora Bas Avram. And if you'd like to sponsor these or other shiurim, please feel free to contact me either on Facebook or at cslando@gmail.com. Now the Gemara goes on to discuss, it had been speaking about the Tachash. The Tachash was an animal whose hide was used to make part of the tapestry that covered the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the Midbar. And the Gemara is a little bit unclear about its status, what exactly it was and what its halachic status is. Mai havi Allah de Tachash. So after having a bit of a discussion and getting sidetracked, the Gemara came back and said, okay, so what's up with the Tachash, Shahaya b'mei Moshe, that existed during the times of Moshe? Amar Rabbi Elah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Elah said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Omer Hoya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir used to say, Tachash Shahaya b'mei Moshe beria b'fnei atzmahi. The Tachash that existed during the times of Moshe Rabbeinu was a unique animal. V'lo hichriu bo chachamim, and the sages were unable to come to a definitive conclusion, imin chayahu o min behemahu, as to whether it was a wild animal or a domesticated animal. V'keren achas hoysalo b'mitzcho, it had one horn on its forehead. Ulefi shon is damen lo l'Moshe, and for a short time it appeared before Moshe. V'asa mimenu mishkan, and Moshe used the hide in the building of the Mishkan. V'nignaz, and after that the Tachash disappeared. Then the Gemara says, Midikamar, since we said Keren Achas Hoysalo b'mitzcho, that it had one horn on its forehead, Shma mino, we can derive from that bit of information, Ta'or Hoya, that the Tachash was a kosher animal. The Amar Rav Yehuda, the Rav Yehuda said, Shor Sheikr of Adam Arishon, Keren Achas Hoysalo b'mitzcho, because Rav Yehuda said that the ox that Adam Harishon brought as a korban had one horn on its forehead. Shenemar, as it says, Vatetev laHashem mishor por makrin mafris. It's a pasuk in Tehillim that says that what this person was doing is better to Hashem than an ox bull that is horned and has split hooves. So you see that the animal that Adam Rishon brought, which is what that pasuk is referring to, had a horn. The Gemara says makrin, with the letter yud between the resh and the nun, tarti mashma. That implies that the animal had two horns. Amar Nachum bar Yitzchak makron ksiv, that the pasuk is written lacking the letter yud, and therefore it implies that there was only one horn. So the Gemara asks, well, from the fact that you're saying that Adam Harishon used this animal for a korban, the lifshot mina, why don't we learn from here demin behemahu, that it must have been a domesticated animal, because only domesticated animals are used for korbanos. And therefore, if Adam Harishon used this animal as a korban, then it must be a domesticated animal also. Gemara says no. Kivan de'ika keresh, there's also an animal called a keresh. Demin chayahu, that is a wild animal. Velesle elachad karna, and it only has one horn. So ikalamemu, we could say min chayahu, that the Tachash also was a wild animal. What is this keresh? That has only one horn, that's a chaya. So interestingly, in the Ein Yaakov, there is on the bottom of the page something called Hamiturgaman, which means the translator. And oftentimes, when the Gemara that Ein Yaakov is quoting uses a word that's a little bit unusual, so the Miturgaman will give you the Yiddish translation of the word. So on the word keresh, the Miturgaman says it's an einhorn. Einhorn would mean a unicorn. Of course, as we all know, unicorns were not real animals. So it's also possible that the word keresh over here refers to a rhinoceros. As far as the issue about the status of a tachash, whether it was a wild animal, a domesticated animal, the Gemara is suggesting that it was something similar to an animal that Adam HaRishon had used for a karban. Rav Kook discusses this Gemara at great length. And I'm going to try to kind of boil down the point as he makes it. And that is as follows. And this is actually sort of like a conundrum that comes up in many places that we find from a Kabbalistic perspective, and that's as follows. When we're serving Hashem, are we supposed to be taking everything that's good in the world and using it to serve Hashem? There's sort of like an inner circle of those things that are good, that are holy, that are pure, and those consist of the materials that we're meant to use with when we serve Hashem. For example, the Gemara says that from the fact that it says in the context of tefillin, Laman tia Torah Hashem beficha, in order that the Torah of Hashem should be in your mouth, the Gemara takes that pretty literally. And it says that any materials that are used for the making of tefillin must be kosher. Or is our role to be taking things that are outside of the realm of holiness and bring them in to holiness? That's why, for example, we find a debate as to whether or not mei raglayim, urine, was used as one of the ingredients in the ketores and the incense used in the Beis HaMikdash. On the one hand, it's a waste product, and it would seem to be something to be inappropriate to be brought on the Mizbeach. On the other hand, it means you're taking the lowest of the low, so to speak, and bringing it in and making it holy. So the debate over here about the Tachash itself, whether it's a domesticated animal, and therefore it was from the set of animals that were generally used for the Mizbeach, for the altar, and for the construction of the Mishkan in general? Or was it a wild animal whose parts generally don't belong in the Beis HaMikdash, but we use its skin as a tapestry on top, because to some extent we're trying to bring that which is outside and bring it in order to incorporate everything in the service of Hashem. At this point, the Ein Yaakov jumps back to where he was up to. You might recall a few weeks ago I mentioned he had jumped backwards. Now the Ein Yaakov jumps back to where he was up to beforehand. Amar of Yehuda, Brei de Rabbi Shmuel bar Shilas mishmei de Rav. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel bar Shilas, said in the name of Rav, Bikshu Chachamim Lignos Sefer Koheles. The sages wanted to hide the book of Koheles, the book of Ecclesiastes. Why? Because the words of Koheles contradict each other. Umipnei ma lo gun zuhu. Why in the end did they decide not to hide it? Mipnei shetchiloso divrei Torah, v'sofo divrei Torah. They saw that the book of Koheles began and ended with words of Torah, and Rashi explains, therefore they presumed that what was in the middle, despite the fact that they initially found it confusingly self-contradictory, but what was in the middle was also words of Torah. Now let's pause over here for a moment. And again, we're going to address Rav Kook. That Rav Kook points out that there's an advantage and a disadvantage to contradiction. You know, my grandfather, Olav Shalom, was a big fan of the commentary of the Abarbanel on the Haggadah of Pesach. The Abarbanel begins his commentary on the Haggadah with 100 questions. And then through his commentary, he endeavors to resolve all 100 questions. So my grandfather's joke was that there was a person who lost his belief in Torah from studying the Abarbanel's commentary. Why? Because he only got through the 100 questions and never got around to reading the answers. So if somebody like Shlomo HaMelech publishes a work which contains statements that on the face value of them, they seem to be contradictory, and if you're going to take that and incorporate it as part of the canon of Torah, then you run the risk that people who will study it will take a look, see the contradictions, not endeavor or not succeed in coming up with a resolution, and therefore come to the conclusion that Torah doesn't make any sense. That's the risk in publishing a work like Koheles. On the other hand, Rav Kook points out that taking two statements which appear to be contradictory and endeavoring and succeeding in explaining where and how each statement applies allows you to really acquire a greater depth of understanding than if the matter had just been laid out for you. Because when you were faced with this contradiction and you had to toil to understand, that takes the ultimate result and really makes it part of your thinking and your understanding. Interestingly, the Ramchal points out in his introduction to the Ein Yaakov, the Ramchal points out that in halachic Gemara, it is replete with pointing out contradictions and resolving them. That there will be statements, whether statements made by Tanoim, the sages of the Mishnah, or statements made by the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara. There will be statements which appear to contradict each other, and the Gemara will posit the contradiction. And the Gemara will say, no, this statement, which seems to be very broad-based, is only speaking under these limited conditions. In Agadata, the Gemara rarely does that. And therefore, we are faced with many statements in Agadata that appear to be very broad statements and are problematic. But they're problematic only if we lack the framework of figuring out and understanding exactly how and when that statement was meant to be understood. But when we take the time to understand the one statement which seems problematic in the context of all of the statements that Chazal, that our sages made, and we can really understand clearly how and when each statement is meant to apply, then we've really acquired for ourselves a deeper understanding. So that is how Rav Kook explains what the conundrum was to Chazal as to whether or not Sefer Koheles, the book of Ecclesiastes, should be included in the canon of Tanakh. Are the contradictions which appear to be there too dangerous for people to handle? Or, as the Gemara is going to do as we go on now, or in our next shir, are we able to tackle these apparent contradictions and figure out how to resolve them, and by doing so, grow in our understanding of Torah? Thank you very much for listening. Have yourselves a wonderful day.